An award show interrupted live on stage. A music catalog sold without her permission. A confrontation with one of the most powerful managers in the industry. And an artist who suddenly realizes her own music no longer belongs to her. The protagonist of all this? None other than Taylor Swift. For years, her career seemed like the perfect story of pop success. But behind the global phenomenon, a much bigger battle was unfolding. The fight for control over her own music. This is the story of the conflict between Taylor Swift and Scooter Braun, a war that changed forever the relationship between artists, record labels, and the world of power. But before we begin, Kanye West. This is the moment that changed everything. Because before Scooter Braun, there was another moment that shaped Taylor Swift's story. The 2009 MTV Video Music Awards. Taylor Swift had just won the award for Best Female Video. She walks on stage, emotional, and begins her speech. But suddenly, someone appears from behind. Kanye West grabs the microphone from her. And in front of millions of viewers, he says, "Beyoncé had one of the best videos of all time." The audience goes silent. Taylor stands there, frozen. That moment becomes one of the most uncomfortable episodes in MTV Awards history. The situation was so bizarre that days later, during a private conversation that would eventually leak, then President of the United States Barack Obama referred to Kanye West with a phrase that went viral around the world: "He is a jackass."
He's getting her award.
Why would he do that?
He's a jackass. No, all this stuff.
That's what King said.
But more importantly, this episode marked the beginning of a narrative that would follow Taylor for years, that of an artist constantly surrounded by public controversy. From country star to global phenomenon, Taylor Swift begins as a young rising promise in country music. A teenager, a songwriter, deeply connected to her audience. Her early albums resonate with an entire generation. But the real turning point comes when she starts crossing over into pop. Albums like Red in 1989 transform her into one of the biggest artists on the planet. But behind the success, there's one crucial detail. Taylor does not control the original recordings of her early albums. Those masters belong to her record label, a detail that years later would become explosive. But before we continue, let's take a look at 3 moments that show the true power of Taylor Swift. First, the war with Spotify. In 2014, Taylor decides to remove all of her music from Spotify. She argues that streaming pays artists far too little. The industry is shocked. A single artist taking on the entire streaming business model. Second, the letter to Apple. When Apple Music launches without paying royalties during its free trial period, Taylor writes an open letter criticizing the decision. Apple changes its policy in less than 24 hours. Third, the fan base. The Swifties become one of the most powerful communities in pop, capable of driving albums, tours, and even wars on social media. And to continue this story, we have to talk about the deal that ignited the war. In 2019, the event that changed everything takes place. Big Machine Records, the company that owned the masters of Taylor's first 6 albums, is sold. The buyer, Scooter Braun, manager of major artists such as Justin Bieber, Ariana Grande, and Kanye West. Taylor says she was never given a real opportunity to buy her own masters. And when the news of Braun's purchase becomes public, she responds with an explosive statement saying, "This is my worst-case scenario." The industry splits. Some support Taylor. Others defend Scooter Braun's business move. Artists, managers, and executives begin taking sides publicly. Social media fills with debates about contracts, intellectual property, and the real power artists have against record labels. What, until that moment, seemed like a conflict between 2 industry figures begins to turn into something much bigger. And instead of giving up, Taylor makes a radical decision. She decides to re-record her own albums. In other words, to re-record all of those songs from scratch in order to own the new versions. The idea was simple, but powerful. If fans listened to and bought the new recordings, the original masters would lose their value. That's how Fearless, Red, and Speak Now are reborn, this time labeled as Taylor's version, and the results were immediate. The new version of Fearless debuted at #1 on the Billboard 200, selling over 290,000 copies in its first week. And the new version of Red was even bigger, more than 600,000 units in its first week in the United States alone. Suddenly, what seemed like a symbolic move turned into something much bigger. Taylor Swift was proving that even years later, she could rebuild the value of her own catalog, and this time, under her control. Years after the microphone incident at the MTV Video Music Awards, it seemed like the relationship between Taylor Swift and Kanye West had finally calmed down. They even appeared together at some public events, but in 2016, everything explodes again. Kanye West releases a new song titled Famous. In one of the lines, he says, "I feel like me and Taylor might still have sex. I made that by I'm famous." The line sparks a new controversy. Taylor Swift claims she never approved those lyrics, but shortly after, Kim Kardashian releases clips of a phone call between Taylor and Kanye. In those videos, it appears that Taylor had been informed about the song. Social media explodes. For days, the internet is flooded with debates about who was telling the truth. For many, Taylor Swift had been exposed. For others, the video had been edited. Years later, when the full recording of the call is leaked, the debate is reignited. But by then, the damage to her public image had already been done. And the conflict with Kanye West's circle, a world where Scooter Braun was also involved, was marked forever. But before we continue, let's look at 3 moments that intensified the conflict. First, artists taking sides. The industry splits. Some support Taylor, others defend Scooter Braun's business move. Artists like Halsey, Iggy Azalea, and Cara Delevingne publicly show their support for Taylor Swift. Even Katy Perry, who had her own rivalry with Taylor years earlier, fully supports her. Kelly Clarkson suggests in a tweet that Taylor should re-record her albums, which may have inspired the strategy that would later become so successful. All of this support helps make one thing clear. This wasn't just a personal feud, it was a debate that spread across the entire music industry. Second, the sale of the catalog. Scooter Braun eventually sells Taylor Swift's catalog to an investment fund. The deal is closed for a figure that, according to industry estimates, is around $300 million. But by that point, the public conflict had already exploded. The dispute between Taylor Swift and Scooter Braun had become one of the biggest debates in the music industry. Third, the impact on the industry. The Taylor Swift case becomes a reference point. What once seemed like a conflict between an artist and her former label now opens up a much bigger conversation within the music industry. Who really controls the value of music once an artist creates it? From that moment on, many musicians begin to take a closer look at the contracts they sign with their record labels. But at one point, something unexpected happens. Justin Bieber enters the scene. When the conflict between Taylor Swift and Scooter Braun explodes in 2019, another name quickly emerges in the story: Justin Bieber. Justin had been working with Scooter Braun for over a decade. In fact, it was Scooter who discovered him on YouTube when he was just a teenager. Their relationship was much more than professional. It was the classic story of a manager and an artist who had built a global career together. So when the controversy over the purchase of Taylor Swift's masters breaks out, Justin decides to step in publicly. He posts a message on social media defending Scooter Braun and criticizing the way Taylor had presented the situation. But the move has the opposite effect. Instead of calming the conflict, it amplifies it. Taylor responds by suggesting that Scooter Braun had been linked for years to moments of public humiliation against her, recalling episodes like the conflict with Kanye West. Suddenly, what had started as a business dispute begins to turn into something much more personal, a story of loyalties, alliances, and old wounds within the pop industry. The battle for control over music. More than just a personal feud, the conflict reveals something deeper. Who really controls the music? the record labels, the managers, or the artists. Taylor turns her personal conflict into a public cause, and with each re-recording, she proves something unexpected, that even in an industry dominated by major corporations, an artist can take back control. The story between Taylor Swift and Scooter Braun was not just a clash between two powerful figures, it was a turning point for the entire music industry. Because for the first time in a long time, millions of fans began to ask a simple question: who really owns the music? This was Behind the Icon, and this was the story of Taylor Swift and her conflict with Scooter Braun, one of the most controversial episodes in the history of music. If you enjoyed this documentary and want to discover the stories behind other major figures around the world, I invite you to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Because behind every icon, there is always a story worth telling.